Well, Alex, we felt that we should get back onto the subject of Ukraine, momentous events taking place, and that sad war still unfolding. What have you got?
Now enter the fourth 6-month period of this war, we could say. People are realizing that it's going to be a long slog. In fact, there's been an interview by Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary-General, very recently to German media, telling them just that, be prepared for the long slog. But this is causing all of the Western media outlets to notice almost simultaneously, a bit like how they're all simultaneously noticing that President Biden isn't fit for office in a coordinated op-ed move. They're all now starting to notice that Ukraine is not winning. The European Conservative has one of the most compelling stories recently. This was set up by the late Sir Roger Scruton, among others. Now, this is not yet a Ukrainian government or presidential demand. It's staying at the level of Parliament and the National Security Council, but it affects Central European countries not far from where I'm speaking from. Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany. Germany alone has something like 1/5 draft-age Ukrainian men in situ, and it's constitutionally barred from extraditing them at Ukraine's demand because dodging the draft is a legitimate reason for asylum in that country. But the Austrian and Czech press and parliaments have said, we will not be doing anything to send the men back. The demand is itself rather telling. Here, with thanks to Three Nations, Rodney Atkinson's website, which will be in the show notes for the source, like everything else, we see a very shocking, alleged, not confirmed, standing order found on the corpse of a reconnaissance soldier apparently killed near Zaporizhia in recent action. Before I go any further, you can see who it's signed by. So if this is a breach of the Geneva Convention, if it does turn out to be genuine, the commanding officers of the 3rd Mechanized Battalion, which is Lieutenant Colonel Zurab Chkheidze, a Georgian surname but serving in the Ukrainian military, and the Chief of Staff, Roman Vlasik, of that 3rd Mechanized Battalion, they're responsible for this. Now, of course, most of us don't read Ukrainian, but if I just blow that up to show the key sentence, which Atkinson also translates on Free Nations, it says, in the case of surrender of Russian parachutists, do not accept their surrender, kill on the spot, and it is strictly forbidden to record the killing. And the rest of it is fairly standard standing orders. Atkinson's page there has a lot more detail on the prosecution of alleged war crimes going on now that some of the captured territory has been captured by the Russian Federation in the south and east, and trials are going on. I cannot vouch for the validity of it. It looks like a genuinely crumpled standing order from a corpse's pocket, but I know that there is a lot of propaganda in this war. A new low, even so, if proved genuine. We're going to have a minute's clip or so now of another new low, which is that a visibly pregnant woman, in fact, for those listening in audio only, she's about to show off her baby bump, visits a specialist uniform tailoring shop run by Ukrainian women for the 5,000 women in uniform in Ukraine. And we're going to see how this woman, now that she's got to several months pregnant, has decided not to be on the front lines anymore, but to go to a rearward position and stay in the armed forces. We're going to see in this clip how delighted she is that her special maternity military uniform is available.
Що там, як, до речі, ваша форма?
Твоя буде в п'ятницю.
Єс! Ну, бачиш, тобі кажу, в мене вже, все.
Я фабрику скидаю, значить, Женька записала відос, я кажу, терміново, треба форма для вагітних. І мені на фабриці дівчата, вагітна.
Brian, I think I have to cut back to you there just to get some response to that. For those listening in audio only, the lady is called Yevgenia Emerald. In the rest of that clip, she explains that she met her love of her life on the front lines, married, both wearing flak jackets. She had a social media followership that was telling her, "You go, girl," and she was promising she was going to stay with the fight until the end of the war. Therefore, she was embarrassed about admitting her pregnancy. She finally came out with the news, and she's been given this new position. And then the girl she's speaking to, Ksenia, in the uniform shop, tells the journalists later in the clip, well, it does happen that we get a dozen orders in and then we get told just make 2 or 3. The rest of the girls have all died. They also make up boxes for the girls on the front lines, snipers in winter conditions who get vaginal and urinary tract infections in the cold. And Ukrainians are apparently proud of this.
Well, is it the Ukrainians that are proud of it, or is it actually Western woke agenda that's come into Ukraine? I think this is terribly sad. It's pitiful to see. But of course, part of this is on the back of the fact that the Ukrainian losses are so horrific, and they are desperate to get any fit adult into the armed forces. And it appears that they're now prepared to stoop as low as pregnant women. So I think this is really horrific, but we've got to remember the losses. We still don't have the full figures, but between 300,000, 400,000 killed, and many people are talking about the offensive running at 500 to 1,000 killed and wounded per day. So this is perilous times for the Ukrainians.
And at the other end of the age scale, Brian, grannies are getting 5 years in jail in Ukraine, as reported by Ukrainska Pravda here, for the crime of logging on to Odnoklassiki, the Russian version of Facebook, banned in the Ukrainian territory, for 3 likes which came up on the grandmother's feed. For this, she has been sentenced to 5 years for glorifying the aggressor, for liking stories that came up. This one actually is taking the threat a step further. First of all, the covering report by Breitbart, which captures the key point of interest in the Zelensky interview, entitled, "Is That a Threat?" Zelensky warns that Ukrainians in Europe could act unpredictably if Western aid is cut. This isn't Breitbart bigging it up. If we go through to the Economist, House Journal of the powers that be, of course, they picked up another matter from the same interview in the headline about Trump's support for Putin. But here's the key passage. Mr. Zelensky says that it would create risks for the West in its own backyard to curtail aid to Ukraine. Well, there's a reason he says that. He senses it's on the horizon. There's no way of predicting how the millions of Ukrainian refugees in European countries would react to being abandoned. His people have generally behaved well and are, quote, very grateful to those who sheltered them, says Zelensky. I would argue differently, seeing the Dutch and German streets. They will not forget that generosity. But it would not be a good story for Europe, says Zelensky, if it were to drive these people into a corner. Blackmail, much, but it gets worse. This may be a fake from the latest information we've been told, particularly because there's a German flag in the bottom corner there, which you don't often see, particularly in Berlin. But it purports to be a Berlin apartment gable end with a cartoon of Zelensky the cannibal ripping off a Ukrainian arm and devouring it. It is said that German police are on the lookout for the artist, but to say it may be fake. Jens Stoltenberg has got in on the action as well. Before we get to that, though, Nord Stream, just to flag up for those who want to read in the show notes, Ola Tunander, a very informed Swede, has brought out a 2-part follow-up to his reporting of what happened a year ago with the blowing up of Nord Stream in the Baltic Sea. He entitles it The Poseidon Attack on Nord Stream. Here, which I won't read, is a great section, well, a large section, I should say, on the use of British Poseidon aircraft from Lossiemouth in the date range 22nd to 26th of September last year, just before the big boom. And so not just Norwegians, as the original Seymour Hersh story claimed as we featured at the time, but look also, he's got plotting going on back to the beginning of September 2022. And you can see that the big 2 East Anglian US Air Force bases nominally owned by the Royal Air Force in the east of England, Lakenheath and Mildenhall, are in the frame because a Boeing P-8A Poseidon, owned by the US, not a British or Norwegian one. This is a key point now. It may be that there was more direct US Air Force involvement than we thought, took off from East Anglia and circled over the later zones of action. And now we come to Jens Stoltenberg in very awful English, which if you freeze the frame, you can savor to your heart's delight. Here are his opening remarks to 2 committees of the European Parliament recently, AFET and SEDE, the Foreign Affairs and the Defence Committees. And at the end of his opening remarks, we are told in terms by Stoltenberg that Putin said in autumn 2021 that if no more NATO enlargement could be promised, he would not invade Ukraine. And Stoltenberg says, of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. And you can see as the paragraphs go on there, he's admitting that NATO had a choice to avoid this war entirely. Something that's more down in the weeds is that the grey zone, with the ever-perceptive Kit Klarenberg, has picked up on a missing detail recently, which is that the biggest arms supplier in Ukraine may have orchestrated the Maidan coup. Now, this goes back to, if I put this frame on screen, people may recognize this from our coverage in 2017, some Georgian snipers who went to a Balkan country to tell Italian journalists in this show, Gli Occhi della Guerra, the Eyes of War, that a Georgian contingent started the shooting in that coup of 9 years ago. The man's name, Mamukar Mamulashvili, was given. Also, the identity of an American with the 101st Airborne, who was apparently their tactical commander. But this has all come to the fore now because even the New York Times has picked up on the fact that that big arms dealer in question, as we reported a couple of weeks ago, although he's an unsavory character, even in the eyes of Zelensky, has been required to source some of the weapons that Ukraine wants now. So it could be an Ouroboros, the Ukrainians eating their own tail as they require the arms to keep flowing in. Briefly on Nicolas Sarkozy, former French president. He has a book to sell, so take this with a pinch of salt if you wish. But he's spoken to Le Figaro, one of the big Parisian dailies, and the headline of his interview is "We need the Russians and they need us." In this section, which I won't translate for want of time, he is talking about how Putin is less irrational than he is told by others. He doesn't believe there's been a big change since 15 years ago when Sarkozy more or less single-handedly, or France single-handedly, stopped the South Ossetia war. I can vouch, having been an expert at the time, that's exactly what the French did. The British did nothing, the Americans did nothing. All the heavy lifting was done by the French to put an end to that Russia-Georgia war. And he says that there's no way Ukraine can join NATO. It's destined by history and geography to be a buffer state. This has caused quite a hoo-ha. Even Anatol Lieven, a big hitter in the mainstream scene, a Chatham House speaker in the past, has pointed out that he's being vilified, is Sarkozy, for speaking uncomfortable truths. Just on screen at the moment, I won't read it out, but Lieven is putting in quite a lot of print here, just why this war should not escalate any further. I haven't seen a journalist of this rank say that to the thinking classes before in the mainstream. Sarkozy's remarks are, the Ukrainians will want to reconquer their territory. He admits it's an unjust war from the Ukrainian perspective. It's been taken from them. But we can't have any return of Crimea because that was Russian until the 1950s. And he also said Russia has to renounce its military action, but Ukraine, for its part, must pledge to remain neutral. Foreign Affairs, this will interest Mark, the House Journal of the CFR, is going in on this as well. So that's just the last coverage of the New York Times saying the same. And of course, being the New York Times, it has to say that Sarkozy is voicing obstinate Russian sympathies. And there is, for good measure, the length of the table at which the current French president, Macron, on the right, has to speak to Putin as of last year. So here's more coverage of the interview with Sarkozy with another source. This is giving an interview with a French broadcaster from France 5 TV. And he says at the bottom there in small print, apologies, we at the Boulevard Saint-Germain, that's the equivalent of Whitehall in Paris, we're very brave in terms of sending young Ukrainians to die. So he's really got the gloves off in a way that you wouldn't have expected. And now, as trailed Foreign Affairs at the end of this segment, the CFR's House Journal is getting into some detail here that even America may lose heart. Having said Europe schmorop, it doesn't really count because, of course, this is an American foreign policy perspective. It says that if the US dropped its support, this would be utterly disastrous. A coordinated browbeating seems to be going on here between Zelensky and some of these system writers for foreign policy. And it's suggesting in the end that you might get a direct Russia-America showdown if America withdraws from Europe. This is the way that the Foreign Affairs couches it. And finally, then, on where this takes us, Newsweek is reporting, of course, a US title, that the editor of a Russian defense journal has said that there may be nuclear strikes. He suggests, without using the name, that the Sarmat ICBM may be what's required. But if you look at even what they've embedded in Newsweek, that you see the name Ben Hodges there, because this was started by a senior NATO logistics general, Ben Hodges, saying we may use nukes on Russia. So it always isn't a one-way street.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for that. Well, it's not a good story, is it, altogether? The fighting goes on, the threats increase, but nobody wants to call for peace and stop it. Let's have a look at one of the retired generals, General Richard Sharif, who's been speaking out. This is with Die Welt. And let's hear what he has to say and how he says it when he's questioned about the success or otherwise of the war in Ukraine.
Ukraine has chalked up some successes on the battlefield in recent weeks. They've actually taken back control of drilling platforms now in the Black Sea. But I wondered if you could give us an idea of some of the scale of the challenges Kiev now faces in order to make further advances.
I think it would be really difficult to overestimate the challenge. I mean, the Ukrainians are ranged against well-established Russian defenses. The Russians have had time to dig in. They know about digging in. They've dug in probably by the book. And the Ukrainians have got to break into that very, very well-established defensive zone, break through it. They've got to take down minefields. They've got to cope with significant artillery incoming fire. They've got to break through, and then they've got to break out. And they've got to do all of this without proper air cover, without air superiority, which no NATO army would consider doing. And in fact, what they're doing is what no NATO army, full stop, has done, an opposed obstacle crossing in really difficult circumstances.
No other NATO army, with the exception of the US, could even take this on, could it, in their current forms?
Oh, I think any NATO army that aspires to high intensity combat operations would be prepared to take this on, but not without an extraordinary amount of time, preparation, training, building up equipment, building up ammunition, and doing it. I mean, in a sense, this is what the coalition did in '91, was to break through the Iraqi defensive position, but it was unopposed. So it was pretty easy going. Nobody's done this since the Second World War in Europe.
Well, there we are. Lots of stutters and ums coming out of that one. Nobody's done it since the Second World War, and nobody's doing it now. Ukrainians dying in vast numbers trying to penetrate those Russian defences without any air cover and without heavy weapons because they are running out. But this is coming to the surface now, as is Western training. So comments here from Ukrainian commanders, one of them saying he'd be dead if he fought exactly how the US and its allies taught him. If we do this very quickly, the point these men are making is that the Western forces supposedly training them don't have the experience of the type of warfare they're engaging in, and therefore some of the training at least is irrelevant to what they're experiencing on the battlefield. Another report here from so-called Dutchman talking to Open Democracy. He says he didn't want to say anything about our partners, but they don't quite understand our situation and how we are fighting. And the commentary goes on to say that we need to understand who we're fighting, and that's because obviously the Russians are particularly tough, including the paratroopers, which is why if the leaflet about shooting them is true, it would make sense. So he says the problem is that the West can't train us because that would be putting boots on the ground, and that would be breaking NATO's rules. But the key truth we're facing is that Western special forces have been on the ground since the earliest days for intelligence, reconnaissance, and a training role. But we've got something else going on, that the Western forces themselves are hamstrung by legal, regulatory, safety and permissions, so they can't do the realistic training the Ukrainians want unless we make some fairly serious policy changes. So that's Nick Reynolds from RUSI admitting that the Western forces can't fight, and until that problem can be removed, obviously we can't actually train the Ukrainians in the first place. So the mess continues.